Welcome back to this series on David Ricardo's theory of value. In the last episode, we discussed how Ricardo integrated the fact of differential rents into his labor embodied theory of value. In this episode, we're going to use the same principles present in Ricardo's theory of rent to integrate differences in inborn ability into Ricardo's theory of value. Ricardo's labor embodied theory accounts for the contribution of acquired skill to value the same way it accounts for the contribution of non-labor inputs, by treating it, of course, as indirect labor. Say, for example, a beaver hunter in Smith's early and rude state must spend 1 hour furnishing a special arrow for every beaver he catches, and the direct act of hunting takes 2 hours. One would expect the value of a beaver to be worth 3 labor hours, meaning it would tend to exchange for 3 of any commodity which it took 1 hour to secure. The same principle holds in the case of acquired skills. Suppose that instead of being required to furnish 1 arrow for every 2 hours spent hunting beavers, a beaver hunter must spend 1 hour honing his beaver hunting skills before every 2-hour hunt. In this case, the value of beavers will be the same as in the case involving arrows. Every beaver will be worth 3 labor hours, 1 hour honing plus 2 hours of hunting. This method accounts for skills that are acquired as the result of training. However, it can't account for unacquired, innate differences in ability. Ricardo doesn't deal with such differences in his work. This leaves a vulnerability in his labor embodied theory. It allows critics to claim its invalidity on these grounds, the grounds that differences in skill, due to what one critic called unequal latent potentiality, can cause the natural prices of commodities to deviate from the respective quantities of labor embodied in them. These critics suppose that, according to the labor embodied theory, the prices of commodities produced by those with superior endowed capacities will sell for different prices than those produced by the more poorly endowed. The Ricardian theory of rent provides the basis upon which innate differences in ability can be integrated into the labor embodied theory of value, all without generating price-value deviations that would invalidate it. The Ricardian theory of rent starts by positing a situation in which additional land available for cultivation is just as fertile as the land presently in cultivation. Let's posit an analogous situation with regard to innate ability. Suppose there are 3 blacksmiths in a town, all of which have the same amount of training. Despite the same amount of practicing their craft, 2 of them are superior on account of their genetic proclivity for, we'll just say, large hands. The smaller-handed bloke must do more work to produce the same output as his 2 competitors. To begin with, let's say that the economy is in a situation where the amount of blacksmithing work demanded is only enough to occupy one of the larger-handed fellows. This situation is much like the starting point of Ricardo's theory of rent. When additional land available for cultivation is equally as fertile as the land currently in cultivation, no rent will be paid for its use. Likewise, when the next blacksmith available for employment has endowments equal to those of the blacksmiths already in employment, his God-given abilities do not fetch him a higher payout, and there's no reason to believe that his gifts would allot him a higher wage, while no blacksmiths of lesser inborn ability are also bringing hammer to anvil. Notice that this theory does not require the absence of latent potentialities in order for these potentialities not to manifest in differences in rates of return. It just requires that all work performed is by those of equal endowment. Differences in wages attributable to innate abilities only start to appear when the expansion of production necessitates the employment of a person who is not as gifted as those currently employed. Take the example of our 3 blacksmiths. Luckily for the ungifted blacksmith, we'll assume that his smaller hands will not be empty forever. An increase in the demand for blacksmithing, for whatever reason, population growth, war, fad for oddly shaped kitchen utensils, etc., this new demand can't be met by the 2 larger-handed blacksmiths. So the remainder of the work, it falls upon our smaller-handed friend. In the moment that the less endowed blacksmith is employed, the more endowed blacksmiths are in a position to charge higher prices in accordance with their greater ability. This is because it requires a greater amount of labor for the inferior blacksmith to produce the same output as the superior blacksmiths. The additional price which these two lucky blacksmiths can charge will depend on the difference between the labor it takes them to produce 1 unit of output relative to the smaller-handed blacksmith. This situation is exactly analogous to the cultivation of less fertile land in Ricardo's theory of rent. Just as differences between the labor costs of cultivation on more fertile land and the labor costs on the cultivation of land at the no-rent margin will determine the size of the rent a landlord is able to garner, productivity differences between a more endowed worker and the least endowed worker will determine the additional income per unit of labor that the former receives. As we mentioned in the last episode, critics of Ricardo's theory of rent have suggested that differential rent costs between firms will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, causing the relative prices for commodities produced on land of differential fertility, even the exact same commodity produced by different firms, to have different relative prices. If this proposition were true, it would invalidate the labor-embodied theory of value. Ricardo argued that this is not the case. Consumers will not prefer to buy commodities which are more expensive when identical, cheaper options are being brought to market by producers operating at the no-rent margin, that is, on land of the least optimal fertility. Firms producing on the more fertile land will be forced to sell their commodities at the same price as the firm producing on the least fertile land, with the quantity of rent charged to the former being proportional to its greater labor productivity relative to the latter. The price of their commodities will have no occasion to deviate from the amount of labor embodied in them under the conditions of production at the no-rent margin. Likewise, just as farmers producing on more fertile land cannot charge more for their commodities than those producing on the least fertile land employed, those who are gifted with superior innate abilities cannot charge more for the same commodity than the least gifted producer of that same commodity. Take our example from earlier. When there's enough demand for blacksmithing to occupy all three blacksmiths, the two larger-handed blacksmiths cannot charge more for the same sword that the smaller-handed one can generate in a longer period of time. The advantage accrued to the superior blacksmiths, then, is not one of higher relative prices per identical commodity. It's one of lower labor costs. The larger-handed blacksmiths might only take half a day to produce what the smaller-handed one has to take a full day to create. Yet the differential labor costs between more and less skilled blacksmiths does not invalidate the labor-embodied theory of value any more than the existence of rents, just as the relative prices of commodities will be proportionate to the labor embodied in them under conditions of production occurring at the no-rent margin. The natural price of commodities produced with varying degrees of innate ability will still be proportionate to the quantity of labor embodied in them by the least gifted producer. Now that we've integrated differential rent and differential ability into Ricardo's theory of value, we're now going to move forward with integrating technical change into Ricardo's labor-embodied theory. That's what we're going to discuss in the next episode. If you're a graduate student or a professor studying economics, particularly history of economic thought, and you have some interesting work you'd be willing to share with me, I'd like to speak with you. Please reach out to me by filling out the form linked in the description of this episode. If you're studying economics at the undergraduate or high school level and you're in need of a tutor, I may be able to help you. You can get in contact with me by filling out that same form. If you'd like to see more content like this, where I discuss various topics in the history of economic thought, please consider checking out my YouTube channel. See you in the next episode.